My grandfather walked out on my mother's family when she was 9 years old. For 40 years, that was simply understood as fact in every corner of my family. A weak, unreliable man who couldn't handle the pressure of a wife and 2 kids and disappeared rather than face it, the way certain men in certain decades sometimes just did. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked for him. He died 3 weeks before this story starts, a stranger to almost everyone who shared his blood, in a small apartment 2 states away that none of us knew he'd ever lived in. Then a storage facility called me, because my name, apparently, was the one listed as emergency contact on an account nobody in my family had known existed, about a unit that had been quietly, anonymously paid for in full, every single month for over 4 decades. I want to tell you about the man I thought I was inheriting a storage unit from, because the distance between that man and the one I actually found inside it is the entire point of this story. His name was Roland. My mother, when she spoke of him at all, spoke of him the way you'd mention a stain you'd mostly managed to scrub out, briefly, with a flicker of old hurt crossing her face, and then a quick change of subject. What I knew, growing up, fit on a single index card. He'd been an engineer at a chemical manufacturing plant in the town where my mother grew up. He'd been, according to family legend, increasingly erratic in the years before he left. Paranoid, my grandmother had apparently said more than once, convinced people were watching him. A man unraveling under some private pressure nobody in the family ever got a clear explanation for. I remember, as a teenager, asking my mother directly what had actually happened, and watching her go very still for a moment before she said, simply, "He decided we weren't worth staying for." That's all there is to know. I believed her completely. I had no reason not to. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday when my mother was 9, he simply didn't come home from work, and never did again. No note, no later contact, no child support, no birthday cards, no single documented attempt, as far as anyone in my family ever knew, to reach out across the following 4 decades. My grandmother raised 2 kids alone on a secretary's salary, remarried once, briefly and badly, to a man my mother still won't discuss in detail, and carried, for the rest of her life, a controlled, permanent bitterness toward the man who'd apparently decided fatherhood wasn't worth the trouble. She died 11 years ago, still believing that. I used to think that was simply sad. I understand now that it might have been the single most successful piece of misdirection I've ever encountered in my life, and that my grandmother went to her own grave as one more person Roland had, deliberately and at enormous personal cost, protected from the actual truth. I got the call from the storage facility on a Thursday afternoon, from a manager who sounded almost apologetic, explaining that the account holder, a Mr. Roland Ashworth, had passed away, that the unit's fees had been paid, without a single missed month, by automatic transfer since the account was opened, and that as the listed emergency contact. I now had 30 days to claim or clear the contents before the facility would need to take further action. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, genuinely confused, certain there had to be some mistake, because as far as I knew, nobody in my family had spoken to Roland Ashworth in 4 decades, let alone maintained a storage account with him listed at my own current address as a contact, an address I'd only lived at for 6 years, which meant, I realized with a slow, uncomfortable chill, that he had been quietly updating that contact information as recently as 6 years ago, without a single one of us ever knowing he was paying attention to our lives at all. I asked the manager, my voice not quite steady, how long the account had actually existed. She checked and told me the original opening date. I did the math twice in my head before I trusted it. 41 years. He had opened that unit within months of disappearing from my mother's life, and had paid for it, without interruption, for every single one of the 41 years that followed, right up until the month he died. A level of quiet, patient consistency that didn't match a single word of the story I'd grown up believing about him. I drove out to that facility 2 days later, in the rain, telling my mother only that I needed to handle some paperwork related to a distant relative, because I genuinely didn't know yet what I was about to find, and some instinct told me not to raise her hopes or her old wounds until I did. I remember sitting in the facility's small front office, signing forms, my hands not entirely steady, the manager sliding a single key across the counter to me with a particular careful gentleness of someone who has clearly handed over keys to grieving strangers before and has learned not to make it feel routine. The unit was larger than I expected and startlingly organized. I want you to picture it the way I actually found it, because the organization itself was the first thing that told me my family's story about this man might be wrong. This was not the chaotic overflow of an unstable person's abandoned life. It was rows of labeled banker's boxes, arranged by year, going back 41 years, alongside a locked filing cabinet, several reel-to-reel audio tapes in protective cases, and, propped carefully against the back wall, a single-frame photograph of my mother at around age 8, the only photograph I would later confirm that Roland had taken with him the day he disappeared. I started with the earliest boxes, and what I found, over the following several hours, rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own family's history. Roland Ashworth had been a process engineer at Corrigan Chemical, a manufacturing plant that had employed close to a third of the working adults in my mother's hometown for decades. In his mid-30s, working a routine maintenance review, he discovered what his own contemporaneous notes described as irregular disposal records for a byproduct of the plant's primary manufacturing process, a solvent that internal company documents, which he'd apparently begun quietly photographing during his own after-hours access to the records office, showed was being dumped, far in excess of legal limits, into an unlined runoff area that fed directly into the water table serving nearly a third of the town, including, I read with a specific sick feeling, the elementary school my own mother had attended as a child. I sat with that particular detail for a long time. The idea that whatever he discovered wasn't some abstract corporate wrongdoing happening to strangers, but something running directly beneath his own young daughter's classroom, every single day, while she sat there completely unaware. I found his internal complaint, dated 14 months before he disappeared, addressed to plant management, laying out the disposal irregularities in the same careful, methodical language of the man's private notes. Page after page of measurements, dates, photographed records, written in the flat, precise voice of an engineer who clearly believed, at that point, that presenting management with sufficiently thorough evidence would simply result in the problem being fixed. I found a response, 3 weeks later, informing him the matter had been reviewed and resolved internally, with no further detail offered, a single paragraph that felt, reading it decades later with the full weight of everything I now knew, almost insultingly thin against the volume of documentation Roland had provided. I found, in a box dated the following year, correspondence Roland had initiated with a state environmental regulator, careful and formal, clearly written by a man trying to escalate through exactly the proper legitimate channels a responsible citizen is supposed to use, and the regulator's eventual, brief reply stating that a preliminary review did not substantiate sufficient grounds for further investigation at this time. Language that, once I'd read enough of Roland's own careful documentation, felt less like an honest conclusion and more like a door being quietly closed by someone with an interest in keeping it closed. And then, in the box dated the year he disappeared, I found a reason. There were 2 items in that box that changed the entire shape of the story I'd grown up believing. The first was a series of typed notes, dated across several months, describing specific instances of being followed. A car parked outside his house for hours at a time. A stranger who approached him in a parking lot to suggest, in Roland's own words, that persistence on this matter would be bad for my family's well-being. A brake line on his own car that a mechanic, per a receipt Roland had kept, found deliberately compromised, in a way the mechanic apparently refused to put in writing out, of what Roland described, in a note dated 2 weeks before he vanished, as the mechanic's own visible fear. The second was a letter, handwritten, unsent, addressed to my grandmother, dated the day before he disappeared, which the storage facility staff told me had clearly never been mailed, tucked instead into an envelope inside the box itself, as though Roland had written it and then decided, in the end, that sending it was too dangerous. I'm not going to read you the whole letter, but I'll tell you what it said, because it is, I think, the single most important document in that entire unit. Roland wrote that he believed, based on what had happened to his car and the threats he'd received, that continuing to fight Corrigan Chemical publicly, as her husband, as the children's father, living openly at the address everyone knew, put all 3 of them in real physical danger. He wrote that he had decided, after weeks of not being able to sleep, to disappear from their lives entirely and completely. not to punish them. Not because he didn't love them, but because a version of him who was simply gone, who could be dismissed by everyone including his own family as a coward who'd run from responsibility, was a version of him that could no longer be used as leverage against the people he loved. He wrote that he intended to keep working the case from a distance, alone, for as long as it took, and that if he ever managed to actually finish it, he hoped, someday, someone in the family might understand why he'd had to become, in the eyes of everyone he loved, exactly the kind of man he was terrified of actually being. He never sent that letter. He simply left, and let my grandmother, and eventually my mother, believe the version of him that required no explanation and endangered no one. The deserter, the coward, the man too weak for family life. He carried that reputation, deliberately and silently, for 40 years, rather than risk the alternative. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for a long time after reading it, in the cold fluorescent light, trying to understand a kind of love I'd never previously had a category for, a man choosing to be hated by the people he loved most, permanently, rather than risk them for even a chance at safety. The remaining boxes, 40 more years of them, told me what he'd actually spent that time doing. Roland had not simply disappeared into obscurity. Working under at least 2 different names I was able to identify from utility bills and old employment records. Names he'd apparently used carefully and consistently for years at a time, before quietly shifting again, a level of practice caution that told me more about how real his fear had actually been than anything else in the entire unit. Moving through a handful of small towns across 3 states, he had spent 4 decades quietly, patiently continuing to build the case Corrigan. Chemical had shut down so efficiently the first time. He'd tracked down and interviewed, over the years, at least 6 other former plant employees who'd witnessed pieces of the same disposal practices and had, like him, either been pressured into silence or simply been too afraid to come forward alone. I found the reel-to-reel tapes I'd noticed on my first pass through the unit contained several of these interviews, recorded, based on the ambient sound and the interviewees' voices, across a span of at least 15 years. Men and women, some clearly elderly by the time he'd finally caught up with them, describing the same runoff area, the same smell some mornings near the eastern fence line, the same quiet instruction from supervisors, decades apart, not to ask questions about where certain barrels actually went. He'd filed and refiled public records requests for decades of the town's water quality data, building, box by box, year by year, a statistical case connecting the plant's documented dumping practices to a specific, elevated cluster of serious illnesses among residents who'd drawn water from that same table over the following decades. Illnesses that, I would later confirm through public health records, had never once been formally connected to the plant in any official capacity, because no single person had ever had, until that storage unit, the complete 40-year picture Roland had spent his entire remaining life quietly assembling, alone, unpaid, unthanked, and, as far as I can tell, completely unaware of whether he would ever actually get to finish it. I found, in one of the middle decades of boxes, a period where his notes grew noticeably sparser, 2 or 3 entries a year instead of dozens, dated across what I'd later work out was roughly the decade I myself was born and raised, and I've wondered since, more than once, whether some part of him had quietly, secretly followed enough of the family he'd left behind to know when a grandchild had arrived, and had simply allowed himself, for a handful of years, the smaller, gentler work of an ordinary life somewhere far away, before the case pulled him patiently back in. He didn't get to finish it. The most recent box, dated less than a year before his death, contained an update to his statistical analysis, current through several months before he died, and a short, final note, addressed to no one in particular, that simply read, "Running out of time to do this myself. If anyone ever finds this, the case is built. It only needs someone left to carry it the rest of the way." I want to be honest about the 4 months that followed, because they were not simple, and I don't want to pretend the ending of this story was easy or quick. I brought what I'd found to an environmental attorney a friend recommended, a careful, skeptical woman named Ms. Okafor, who told me plainly, in our first meeting, that 40-year-old grievances against a company that had grown, merged, and rebranded itself twice since Roland's original complaint would be an extraordinarily difficult case to actually litigate, and that my grandfather's own decades of private documentation, however meticulous, would need real, modern verification before any regulator or court would take it seriously. She spent almost 2 hours that first afternoon simply going through the boxes with me, occasionally stopping to read a page twice, and I remember the specific moment her professional skepticism visibly cracked. Somewhere around the third reel-to-reel interview transcript, a former plant worker describing, in plain unpracticed language, exactly the same runoff area Roland's original 1980s photograph showed, decades apart, and with no way either witness could have coordinated their stories. "This is either the most elaborate fabrication I've ever seen," she told me, "or your grandfather actually built a real case." I don't think it's the first one. I spent the next several months working with her office, and eventually with a state environmental investigator willing to take a fresh look at the water quality data with modern testing standards Roland had never had access to, cross-referencing his decades of handwritten notes against records that, once someone in an official capacity actually went looking with his 40-year map in hand, proved remarkably, damningly consistent. There were setbacks I hadn't anticipated. A records request that took 11 weeks longer than promised. A moment where Ms. Okafor genuinely worried the statute of limitations on certain claims might bar us entirely. Resolved only when the investigator found evidence the contamination was ongoing rather than purely historical, which reopened the legal window in a way none of us had been certain would hold up. The company that now owned the old Corrigan chemical site, renamed, restructured, publicly traded, run by executives with no personal memory of a disposal complaint filed decades before most of them were hired, did not simply capitulate once the new investigation began. There were months of denial, of lawyers, of a public statement calling the renewed inquiry a matter of historical record with no bearing on current operations. A company spokesperson, in one particularly frustrating exchange Ms. Okafor relayed to me after a mediation session, suggested that Roland's own decades-old documentation should be treated with skepticism given that it came from a man who had, by his own family's account, abandoned his responsibilities and vanished under circumstances of clear personal instability. A sentence that made me understand, with real clarity, exactly how effectively his 40 years of quiet self-sacrifice had also, unintentionally, been used against him by the very people who had good reason to want him discredited. What ultimately moved it, in the end, wasn't outrage or public pressure, though there was eventually some of both once a local journalist picked up the story. It was the same thing that had always mattered most in Roland's own careful, patient work: the documents. Modern soil and groundwater testing, conducted at the specific sites Roland's 40-year-old notes had identified, found contamination levels still measurably elevated above safe limits, in exactly the pattern his original 1980s documentation had predicted decades in advance. Faced with hard current data that traced directly back to a complaint the company had quietly buried 2 generations of executives earlier, the company settled, 18 months after I first opened that storage unit, funding both a full site remediation and a compensation fund for affected long-term residents, without ever formally admitting wrongdoing, which is, Ms. Okafor told me, about as close to a full confession as cases like this usually get. I want to tell you about the day I told my mother, because it matters more to me than the settlement itself. I drove to her house with a single banker's box, not the whole archive, just the letter, the internal complaint, and a handful of the earliest photographs. And I sat with her at her kitchen table, the same table she'd done homework on as a 9-year-old girl whose father had, as far as she understood her entire life, simply stopped loving her enough to stay. I watched her read that unsent letter twice, slowly, her hands not quite steady on the pages, and I remember, specifically, the moment her eyes reached the line about the break line, and how she set the page down flat on the table for a moment before picking it back up, as though she needed both hands steady before she could keep going. She didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. When she finally did, she said, "I spent 40 years being angry at a man for choosing himself over us." I told her I didn't think that was what had actually happened. She looked up at me and said, quietly, "No, I don't think it was either. Not anymore." She asked me, after another long silence, whether he'd ever tried to see her in all those years, and I had to tell her honestly that I hadn't found any evidence that he had, that whatever love had driven him to disappear had also, apparently, driven him to stay disappeared, completely, for her own protection, right up until the moment he could finally hand the whole thing to someone else instead. I watched that answer land harder than almost anything else in the letter itself. A different, quieter kind of grief settling into her face. For 4 decades of a father who'd loved her enough to vanish, and not quite enough, in the end, to ever risk coming back. I don't think 40 years of grief and anger simply dissolve in one afternoon at a kitchen table. And I want to be honest that my mother's relationship with his memory is still, months later, complicated in ways I don't fully understand and don't think I'm entitled to resolve for her. But she visits his grave now, which she never once did before that day, and she brought the framed photograph of herself at 8 years old, the one thing he'd taken with him when he left everything else behind, and put on her own mantle, where it still sits. She told me, the last time I visited, that she'd started talking to him there sometimes, at the grave, short ordinary sentences about her week, the kind of thing she said she wished she'd had 40 years to say instead of 4 months. It's raining tonight. The way it was raining the day I first drove out to that storage facility with no idea what I was about to find. I still have most of the boxes, 41 years of a man's quiet, unglamorous, thankless second life, carefully preserved in a storage unit that's finally, properly, in my own name now, instead of a stranger's automatic monthly payment. I've kept the unit going, month to month, the same way he did, though for entirely different reasons. I'm not ready yet to decide what should happen to 41 years of one man's evidence and grief and patience. And some part of me suspects I may end up paying that same quiet monthly bill for a long time before I am. I think about him more than I ever expected to think about a grandfather I never actually met, a man who understood, decades before I was even born, that sometimes the most protective thing you can do for the people you love is let them believe the very worst version of you, and carry that reputation alone, in silence, for the rest of your life, so that the people who matter most never have to carry the actual danger themselves. I think about the specific loneliness of that choice, not the loneliness of being disliked, which most people can eventually make peace with, but the loneliness of being disliked for exactly the wrong reason, forever, by the people whose good opinion you'd have given almost anything to keep, and choosing it anyway because their safety mattered more to you than their understanding ever could. My family called him a coward for 40 years. I've come to believe he was, instead, the bravest person I will ever be related to, and that the specific unbearable shape of his courage was that almost no one, including the people he loved most, ever got the chance to see it while he was alive to be thanked for it. The case is finished now, the way his last note hoped someone might eventually finish it. But I think, if I'm honest, the thing I actually inherited from that storage unit wasn't a settlement, or even his vindication. It was proof that love and abandonment can look, from the outside, exactly identical for 40 straight years, and that sometimes the only way to tell them apart is to wait, patiently, for someone left behind to finally open the right box.